We may hate the question, but it's time to ask it. Is it time to mask up again? I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story, and today we're going to try and understand on this special broadcast the H3N2 virus. It's a mouthful, and we, the layperson at least, don't understand it really well. But in the aftermath of COVID, maybe we don't want to hear about it at all. But we must, because in parts of India, schools are shutting down again as precaution. Remember, some schools were closed for almost 2 years through the pandemic, and our children can scarcely afford for this to happen again. So, what do we know? What should we be doing? Can it be prevented? If you get it, what is the medicine you should take? Who are the most vulnerable? And as I said, is it time to mask up again? We don't have an official death toll yet, but media reports and compiling them suggest that at least 9 people have died from the H3N2 virus, a kind of influenza with symptoms similar to the common cold, the flu, and indeed even to COVID. Many people who are contracting this are additionally reporting cases of pneumonia. So, a lot to understand here, and let's bring up our panel of experts as we look at this virus, not a new unknown virus, thankfully, like COVID, but still a lot going on that after COVID, no one wants to take chances with. On the program today, Dr. Lancelot Pinto is with us. He's, of course, at the Hinduja Hospital. Good to see you, Dr. Pinto, after a while. Brian Wahl, well-known epidemiologist, is with us. Great to see you again, Brian. Also joining us is Dr. Anita Ramesh. Dr. Anita Ramesh is an oncologist. She's at the Apollo Group. Good to see you, ma'am. And also joining us is Dr. Rajesh, who's, of course, a director at the Jaslok Hospital and the author of a very well-regarded book on COVID. Welcome, all of you. And let me start with you, Dr. Rajesh Parikh. What do we know? What do we not know? H3N2, when most people hear the combination of letters and numbers, either you think it's a bad, not so strong password, or you think it's another dreadful virus. This is not a new virus. Why is it hitting us in the way it is?
You're absolutely right, Barkha. These alphabets and numerics now can become somewhat intimidating, even for those of us who are monitoring this all the time. I'm not sure this is a consolation. An attenuated form of a virus which was already around. So there was a pandemic in the 60s, 1968. That pandemic of the H3N2 virus resulted in 1 million deaths. Now, mind you, this at a time when our tracking mechanisms weren't as good as they are, communication, information technology was in its primitive stages, so it's possible that the deaths were even higher. At that time, they worked incredibly fast, actually, if you consider that it was 55 years ago, and got a vaccine out. Fortunately or unfortunately, the vaccine came out just as the pandemic had abated, so it was not used. So the good news for us today is this is not a new virus. This is a familiar beast. Second, it's an attenuated or weakened form of something that's far more sinister early on. And we've seen that also in the mutated strains of the COVID virus. And third, the vaccine is already ready. We've had a vaccine ready for 55 years. So I think those are perhaps mitigating factors in dealing with this virus.
Well, that's good to hear. Let me take that to Dr. Pinto. I have to sort of do a mea culpa here and say I have many friends who take the flu vaccine annually. I've never taken it, not even after 2 years of the pandemic. And opinion is also divided because there are so many strains of viruses that make up or can trigger what we call flu that it's impossible to actually know, Dr. Pinto, whether one generic flu vaccine will protect you against everybody. Are you seeing something these days that causes you concern? Or do you agree with Dr. Parikh that we sort of understand this, we've been here before, no need to panic, no need to take measures, for example, that schools in Puducherry have taken where schools are actually closing down? Dr. Pinto.
Hi, Barkha. Thank you for inviting me. At the outset, I think it's important to let people know that influenza is not something new. So we generally in India experience 2 peaks. There's one peak somewhere just before the monsoons or around the monsoons. And there's a second peak typically, which happens in North India, which happens towards the end of the winters. So unlike North America, where it's predominantly a winter thing, we tend to have 2 peaks in India. The second thing that we must realize, so for example, if you look at the US data, there is the surveillance says that about 8% of all adults will have influenza in a given season. And I suspect that's not too different from what the case in India must be as well. It's just that our ability to detect has improved over the years. We have RT-PCRs which are available. We have certain tests called the biofires which are available now, which detect a whole panel of viruses. As a result of which, we are picking up more influenza than we probably did. Now, I was looking at the literature, and there was a modeling exercise done somewhere in 2010 to 2013, which said that around 130,000 individuals die every year in India because of influenza. So again, that is well known that individuals who are immunocompromised, who are elderly and under 5, are at a high risk of having poor outcomes. So given that as a background, if you ask me, am I seeing something very atypical? I don't necessarily think so in our day-to-day practice. Are we detecting more? Yes, because we are sending more swabs. Almost every hospitalized patient with viral symptoms these days will have a respiratory PCR done for influenza. I was looking at our own statistics at my hospital, and 10% of the swabs were positive in January, and it's about close to 20% in the month of March up till now. So the positivity rate has gone up, but there's also a reflection of the fact that we're testing a lot more. To answer your question about the vaccine, I think it's pretty much the same as COVID. If you are immunocompromised, if you are a high-risk group, unlike COVID, children under 5 are a high-risk group here for influenza. Pregnant women are a high-risk group for influenza. So if you fall into these categories, I think taking the influenza vaccine is not a bad idea at all.
Dr. Ramesh, if I may get you in, Dr. Anita Ramesh, do you think schools need to be closing? I feel very strongly about this because I was one of those who didn't think schools should have been shutting even through several phases of the COVID pandemic. Dr. Anita Ramesh, what would you say on that?
What my feeling is that, Barkha, I'm being a cancer specialist. I had many of my patients was infected and they were all positive, and 2-3 people also went into ICU. Even my assistant was also infected. So it is little infectious, but what I can say, nothing to worry. There was no deaths and nobody needed ventilator. They had fall in the BP, headache, high spiking fever and cough. And the problem is that the cough persists more than 3 to 4 weeks. So that's little frightening and it does not come down. Yes, taking this into consideration with people getting positive, high fever, running for 6 to 7 days with few admissions, but no mortality, not alarming. Yes, schools, they need to take a decision whether they want to close. I think this may not close also. If you follow the strict guidelines of social separation, wearing mask, hand hygiene, and to see that.
So the mask should be back?
Yeah, should be back at when the gathering is more. Suppose if you're at home, we don't tell you, but if you are in a crowded place, yes, might need.
I mean, I think it would be easier to convince Indians at this point, and I'm not making a for or against argument, to get multiple tests, go on multiple courses of vitamins, but not wear a mask. There's a social resistance to it, maybe because of what people went through in these 2 years. Brian, what are epidemiologists finding? Everyone seems to agree in this conversation. This is not new. This is not unknown. Why then are we seeing it get the attention that it is? Is it just that we are, in a way now, because of COVID, we will never look at any virus the same way again. We will over scrutinize and put everything under the microscope, literally and metaphorically.
Thanks, Barkha. A couple of things happening. One, I think you're absolutely right. We hear that there is we hear that there is a virus circulating, and of course we're concerned. The other thing, and I think it's actually a silver lining here, is that surveillance systems are actually picking up the fact that there is a circulating human influenza virus. And so the fact that our surveillance systems are picking this up, I see as a good thing. I think one thing I just want to also mention with regard to the school closures question. The first thing is that human influenza virus, from year to year, we see variations in terms of both how much the disease spreads as well as how severe it is. Now, school closures with H1N2 H3N1 in 2009 did seem to shorten the duration of outbreaks in places where those school closures were implemented, and a reduced number of total individuals who were infected. This was the basis on which school closures were initially considered for addressing COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 is a very different virus from human influenza virus, and I do not believe that school closures for COVID, with hindsight being 2020, did not necessarily make sense. Now, for human influenza virus, where we do have the evidence that children do play a more significant role, not a majority role, but do play a more significant role in transmission, there is some basis for such school closures. However, those school closure decisions need to be taken into the context of how rapidly and how widely the virus is spreading and how severe it is. And what I'm seeing in terms of the severity and how much this is spreading, I don't think that necessarily school closures are warranted, at least at this time. If they are, it would be for a short period of time, given how quickly human influenza virus outbreaks peak and then come down.
Dr. Parikh, would you agree? You know, there are certain social habits that one would have thought would have remained entrenched after the pandemic. Much like, for example, Southeast Asian countries. You go to Singapore, Hong Kong, for example. The mask is almost like a daily fixture. You see it commonly on the road. But Indians haven't behaved that way. You may see doctors like yourselves wearing masks, but most people are not wearing masks anymore, right? Dr. Parikh, what are you seeing in hospitals right now? And these cases that are coming in, Dr. Pinto says, yes, there's a surge, but it's a seasonal surge. It's nothing out of the ordinary. Why then are we going into this tailspin? There are, districts on alert in Uttar Pradesh. There are schools being closed in Pondicherry. I guess, we're all burnt by the pandemic, but medically, what would you be calling for right now?
Well, I would just continue in the same upbeat mode that my three colleagues have been so far, and perhaps I might justify it a little more. The first thing is, of course, in addition to what everybody has said, the RT-PCR test has become rather sophisticated now. Earlier, it would just detect the coronavirus, and now it's detecting 9 or sometimes even 11 different viruses, including the H3N2. So our surveillance methodology is considerably better, much better, in fact, than it was during the earlier pandemic. The other thing is that all the viruses that are going around currently are mutated or recombinant forms of earlier viruses, and therefore they're much weaker. The issue, of course, is, and I think that's something that we need to monitor and pay attention to, that we have at least 4 viruses going around, and when someone gets infected, other than by an RT-PCR, it isn't always easy to clinically identify which virus we think is working. So the 4 viruses, of course, first, I think we've talked considerably about it over the years, is the coronavirus, which is now in a mutated version, but not gone. Okay. Today is what, the 16th of March. Yesterday was the anniversary of Caesar's death, 44 BC. Ides of March, Julius Caesar got assassinated. He was warned, he was forewarned by a soothsayer that this would happen. As he was walking towards the Senate, he saw the soothsayer and he told him the Ides of March have come. And, famously the soothsayer said, yes, but not yet gone. And then a few minutes later, he got assassinated. So there is a mutated form of the coronavirus going around. We can hope for the best. Then for years, there have been 2 mutated variants of the mother of all pandemics, the 1918-1920 Spanish influenza, which killed 100 million people then. I mean, that's the equivalent of nearly 500 million people dying today. So far, far more sinister proportionately than the COVID pandemic. So there are 2 mutated forms. They take their own toll in the United States every year and around the world. Then, of course, we have the H3N2 that we spoke of. And, that again comes from a combination of 2 previous pandemics. There was a pandemic in 57, 58. And at that time, the count was about 2 million. Again, we're talking of the mid-50s. Some people estimate it at 4 million. Given the population of the world then, which was approximately 2.5 billion, you can say, in current times, it's 3 times as worse. So far more sinister than what we are going through now. And we have a mutated version of that, combining with the other pandemic that I spoke of. So in the H3N2, one component comes from the avian influenza component, and another harks back to the earlier pandemic. And then we have H1N1, the 2009 pandemic, the swine flu. So, they're all 4 gallivanting around us. And I haven't given up on the mask as yet. So as you said, it's become a part of my habit. A lot of my colleagues do it. Some of them don't. Which of us is being too careful or too reckless? I guess time will tell.
Yeah, but from that fascinating history to practical questions like what medicines one should take, and that's something I want to take to Dr. Pinto straight away. Dr. Pinto, here's the question. You were one of those voices during the pandemic who sort of warned against the kind of over medication that was taking place during the pandemic. There was a lot of sort of groping in the dark at that time. So mistakes were made and learned from in every phase. Steroids were overused. Antibiotics were overused. Ivermectin was used for no good reason. All kinds of things were used. Now, what started to happen is that people have started self-prescribing. And I think it's very important in this program to tell our audience what they shouldn't be doing if they test positive for this virus. So Dr. Pinto and Dr. Ramesh, for both of you, I'll start with Dr. Pinto.
For most individuals, influenza tends to be a very mild, self-limiting illness. So 2 or 3 days of fever, body ache, sore throat, nasal congestion, and whatever combination, a little bit of a cough sometimes. The fever tends to settle in a couple of days. The cough can sometimes be prolonged. So we know that there are post-infective or post-viral coughs which can last for as long as 4 to 6 weeks at a time. Steroids, in fact, the original evidence of steroids being bad during an active viral infection came from influenza. So steroids, again, an absolute no-no in the early stages of the disease. The drug that works or has shown to work to some extent is a drug called oseltamivir, or the famous Tamiflu, brand name. But it tends to work well when it's started within the first 24 to 48 hours. So if you are a high-risk individual, and if for some reason testing is going to get delayed, and there is an outbreak around, it does look like a viral infection, if everything fits in, you sometimes would want to start the medication upfront while you're waiting for the results. And if the result comes back negative, you can choose to discontinue it. Close contacts of individuals with confirmed influenza can use a prophylaxis for up to 7 days. So they use the same dose of Tamiflu, but once a day instead of twice a day. And that's recommended for up to 7 days. Apart from this, most of the treatment is symptomatic. So if you have a fever, you would take paracetamol. If you have a cough that's productive, you might take something that opens up your lungs and helps you bring out the phlegm. If you have a sore throat, gargling would help. And rest and hydration, which is pretty much the rule for most viral infections. So most of it would be symptomatic treatment. We wouldn't. So another common problem is that we have certain antibiotics which are just sold as if it's tap water, so to speak. Yeah. So there is a very knee-jerk reaction to starting antibiotics whenever there's a fever. And I think that's something that we should really avoid, considering the amount of antimicrobial resistance that we are seeing in the country as well.
And you're always told it's for secondary infections. I just went through pneumonia myself, so I have some experience of this personally. But Dr. Anita Ramesh, you are actually dealing with a different order as an oncologist of people. You're dealing with immunocompromised people where the approach might be very different. And I think that's important to talk about. So go ahead.
Yes, see, I'm immunocompromised. And during the COVID now also, we see a couple of more admissions with this virus coming in, and they do more sicker, and they all do have diabetes and hypertension along with that. And I had multiple admissions with these patients, ICU admission, but nobody went on ventilator and there was no mortality. Definitely the risk in this immunocompromised individuals are higher, particularly those who are in uncontrolled malignancy, hematological malignancies, those who are in palliative care with renal failure, uncontrolled diabetes, uncontrolled hypertension, those with lung metastasis plus interstitial lung disease, and those with on transplant, post-transplant, dialysis, okay, organ transplant, these 10 to 15 subset of individuals are all at high risk. So we cannot take the influenza. Yes, influenza is there, but now it is little higher than the common influenza. We do see admissions. So we cannot let our guards down. We have to be alert, and let's not miss it. Being a little over protective will not put you into anything wrong.
No, I agree. I agree. But I think human behavior is, human beings are wired. We're wired in a strange way. And I think people are still reacting to COVID in different sort of ways. Some talking about long COVID, others just don't want to hear the word COVID. So I think we have to sort of account for psychological, responses as well, or, psychosomatic behavior, as it were. Brian, is there anything leaping out from research? In particular, there are people who are talking a lot about long COVID. People don't know how to read their symptoms. At which point do you think that it's, necessary to go to a doctor? So many people will self-prescribe even that paracetamol. They will not go to the doctor. They will not do the RT-PCR. They will not want to know what strain it is. There is an avoidance factor here. There are two kinds. There are the hypochondriacs and there are the avoiders.
Absolutely. In terms of the research, I think it's important to note that this is an ongoing situation, and the research or the data that we're seeing is surveillance data. Sometimes surveillance data underestimates the true burden, even though I think we are seeing a burden that is potentially greater than previous years because of increased surveillance. But in terms of the research, there isn't much research coming out just yet. We're still in what we would call the fog of war, and so staying vigilant and keeping an eye on things. In terms of when to seek medical care, I would leave that to my clinician colleagues on the panel. But I completely agree. I think there are those who avoid care and those who over seek care, and finding a happy medium between the two of those is critical. I'll leave that to my clinician colleagues, though.
Well, I think the good news in this conversation is that there's nothing new and unknown that we're grappling with. This comes with the season. It'll go with the season. Keep your eyes and ears open, your mouth and nose covered, is what most doctors would say, at least in crowded spaces. And as they say, watch this space. The schools closing is something perhaps that needs deeper thinking. So far, I've only read this measure being taken in Pondicherry, but one rather fears that once it starts happening in one part of the country, others tend to follow. Parents get paranoid. So one should one should sort of caution that there isn't need. That's what our experts have said, at least yet, to be doing that. That could change if the numbers change. We leave it there for now. Dr. Ramesh, Dr. Parikh, Brian, Wahl, Dr. Pinto, thank you so much. And to our audience, stay safe, stay healthy. See you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.